Welcome to the MarkLogic Security video series from MarkLogic University. This video is the sixth part in a series of topics covering key concepts to master when implementing a security model in MarkLogic. In this video, we'll take a look at using AMPs. After completing this tutorial, you'll be able to describe AMPs and their purpose in an application, as well as to set up and use AMPs in an application. To follow along with this tutorial, you'll need to download and install MarkLogic. As we progress throughout this tutorial, we'll refer to various pieces of code. These examples are available through the MarkLogic University GitHub site. So let's start by thinking about what the word AMP really means. The word AMP is short for amplify. Think of it like this. When a musician needs to play in a large venue, they're going to plug their instrument into an amplifier. And that amplifier then boosts the electrical signal coming from the instrument, resulting in an increase in the volume of the music. An AMP in terms of MarkLogic security is similar. It's going to provide a boost, which will temporarily grant a user additional roles when they execute a specific function. Now remember that a user is assigned roles, and those roles dictate what that user can do. For example, our user might normally have the secret read role. An amped function boosts what a user can do in the system by temporarily providing them an additional role. This role can enable them to perform a particular action within that function, but the role is only temporarily granted for the scope of that function call. When the amped function has run, the role is taken away. This gives you the benefit of being as restrictive as possible with regards to your security model, but still maintaining the ability for a user to perform elevated actions when it makes sense within your application. In general, try to keep in mind a good best practice when it comes to designing your security model. And that best practice is to give users the minimum rights needed to do their job. Within an application, it may be appropriate for a user to do something that requires elevated rights, but instead of permanently granting those rights, we'll use an AMP to provide the temporary ability to perform a certain function. Now let's take a look at a real-world example of an AMP in action. All the systems that run MarkLogic University are powered by MarkLogic technology. And this includes our on-demand website and the mobile app that you're using to watch this video tutorial. Another example of a system that we have built allows you to take a self-paced version of one of our full-length instructor-led training courses. And that's the site that we're looking at here. Now, when a user first comes to this site, they're being treated as the default user. And our application server is automatically going to assign them the roles associated with that default user. Now, this default user purposefully has very limited power. So if I'm simply browsing around, I may wish to explore a specific course to learn more about it. So when I click on a course, I'm able to view the course details, and one of the pieces of information that comes back to me is the actual length or duration of the course. Now, this is calculated programmatically. It's doing a sum of the duration of each of the videos that make up that course. Each of those videos is stored in the MarkLogic database, and metadata about each video has been extracted and stored in the MarkLogic database as well. And that includes a piece of information about the video length. However, the default user doesn't have read permissions on any of those videos or the metadata about those videos in the database. And this is purposeful as part of our security model because we only want to enable known authenticated users to be able to read that data. We don't want to grant the unknown default user any more power than is absolutely needed. But we want to be able to show this default user how long the course is. So how do we solve that problem? And the way we solve that problem is by implementing an amped function. We can then temporarily grant the default user a necessary role that will allow them to read that data in order to sum up the duration of each video in the course so that they can see how long a specific course is. And when the amped function completes, that role is then taken away from them so that we can adhere to our best practice of only giving a user the necessary rights to do exactly the job that they need to do and nothing more. Now let's implement an amp for the example that we have been building out in this video series. If you haven't yet completed the previous episodes in this series, you'll want to go back and do so before you try to do the hands-on exercises that are part of this tutorial. But if you've been following along with the examples that we've been building throughout this series, you'll remember that our security model is currently set up like we see here. Note that bond only has the secret read role. That's in line with our security best practice of giving users the minimum rights they need in order to do their job. This means that bond has read permissions on documents that are classified as secret, but he doesn't have any permissions that would allow him to do something like a document update. But sometimes it might be appropriate for bond to be able to do an update to a document. For example, what if he needs to send a status update from the field back to his headquarters? Rather than permanently giving bond the project admin role, which would enable him to do this update, let's instead only give him the ability to run a specific update function in our application by temporarily granting him the project admin role. To do this, we're going to implement an amp. Now let's walk through how we're going to set this up. In order to follow along with this example at home, you will have first wanted to complete all of the exercises in the prior episodes in this series. Then you'll need to go out to the MarkLogic University GitHub site where you can clone the repository for this series, and that will give you access to all the files that you're seeing here on my file system in the episode 6 folder. The first thing we should study when looking at this example are the server-side JavaScript modules that represent our application. So let's start by taking a look at ampedfunctions.sjs. Here we're creating a library module that's going to contain the function that is going to actually perform the update. Now we know that bond does not have a role that would enable him to do this. So this update function is going to have to be amped. So if we just look at the function definition here, we see a function called update status. It's getting two pieces of input, and what this function is going to do is perform an update to one of the documents that already exists out in our database. And it's going to use the JavaScript function node insert after to add a new node to that document. Then we export this function and we can then use it from our main module. So next, let's take a look at that main module, which is statusUpdate.sjs. And in this module, we see that the first thing we're doing is we're going to bring in that library module called ampedfunctions. We're going to create a variable that represents the date and the status message that we wish to do for our update. And then we're going to call that function that we have in our library module and pass it in the status date and the status message. Now that we've taken a look at our application code, let's go ahead and set everything up in order to implement this amp. To get started with that, let's open up Query Console on port 8000 and let's import the workspace for this associated exercise. And so I'm going to browse out to the location on my file system where I've cloned that data from GitHub, and I'm going to look in the episode 6 folder and import security episode 6. And when we look at this workspace, let's start with the tab titled Review Permissions. This tab is simply meant to just refresh our memory on what our current security setup is that we've implemented in these prior episodes. And so what we're doing is we're going to go out and get the permissions from a particular document, and we're going to bring back from the security database which roles and which permissions are set for this document. And so if we run this, we'll see that we have an update permission set for the project admin role, and that we have a read permission set for the secret read role. And we know that Bond, our user, has the secret read role. which means he will be able to read this document, but he does not have the project admin role, which means he will not be able to do the update. That's why we're going to implement the AMP. So the next step is to then load those server-side JavaScript modules that we took a look at. And here I'm declaring an update, and I'm setting a couple variables that will reference where those files are. Depending on where you've stored this data on your local machine, you may need to update that path. I'm also selecting the modules database from the content source, as that's where I'd like to place these bits of code for my application. And then I'm using the XDMP document load function to load each of these documents. And because these documents represent code in a modules database, you'll notice that I'm setting the permissions, specifically an execute permission. So let's go ahead and run this code, and we should be able to then explore our database and see that the AMP functions and status update modules have been loaded. You'll also notice that I have some of those other modules that we used from our prior episodes. Now that I've loaded these modules in the database, the first thing I'd like to do is a test. Let's just make sure all the code works. So let's go ahead and select the tab titled Test Module. And what's happening here is we have simply took all of the code that is in the status update module and dropped it in here in Query Console. So you'll see we're going to be performing the function call from our library module where we've created that amped function. And I just want to simply validate that all the code is working. So if I explore my database and I look at our document that we're going to be updating, I should see the original content in here that we see right now. And if I run this code and then explore the database and look at the document, we should see that it has been updated with our status message. And I'm able to do this simply because I'm logged into Query Console as an admin. And so as an admin, I'm going to have no problem with updating that document. But if I was logged in with some other user, such as Bond, I would have had a problem because we haven't yet set up the AMP. All right, so that's what we're going to do next. In order to get back to our original state, let's click on this tab titled Update with Original Document. And this is simply going to do an update to that document URI with the original content. So we're eliminating that status update that we just did in our test. So we run that, we explore the database, and if we were to look at that document again, we'll see that we're back to our baseline. There is no status update. All right, let's go ahead and test this out then. In our tab titled Test 1 Without AMP, we've just got a comment that kind of describes what it is we're going to be testing. And what it is that we wish to do is to actually run this code from our application server. And we're going to try to do it with a variety of different users. We're going to start out with our M user. Now, if you recall, M has the project admin role. So we would expect her to be able to do this document update. Let's test it. I'm going to open up a new browser session so that I can easily authenticate in as a certain user into my app server. And I'm going to hit my app server, which we created in an earlier episode on port 8010. And specifically, I want to run the status update.sjs module that we have in our modules database. So if I click on that, I'm then going to be prompted to log in. I want to log in with our M user, so that's a username of M and a password of pass. And when I run this, you'll note that I actually get an error. And this is a classic example of what we talked about in our prior episode on execute privileges. M, who is a project admin, does not have a required execute privilege in order to run the code that we've written in our modules. Specifically, in order to do that update, she's going to need a privilege called XDMP value. And again, my test as an administrator didn't encounter this issue because as an admin, I had that privilege. So in order to get this to operate, the first thing we're going to need to do is provide the project admin role with the appropriate execute privilege. So let's go back to our Query Console workspace and select the tab titled Set XDMP Value Execute Privilege. So here we're going to use the Management REST API to build a request out to the endpoint called Privileges, and we're going to give our project admin role the XDMP value privilege. And we can see here that in our configuration we have specified to give this to the role called project admin. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. This will set the appropriate execute privilege, and we see a success response. Now let's go back to our browser and try to run this again. So I'm going to hit refresh, and now I see that I was successful. And I could confirm that by going out and looking at that document, and I would see that in fact the status update has been created. So now I know that I'm able to do this if I log in as the M user. But what about if I log in as Bond? Let's test that out next. So to get back to my original state, I'm going to click on this tab titled Update with Original Document. I'm going to run that, and that will essentially undo that status update that we just implemented. Now let's take a look at this tab titled Test2 without AMP. And what I want to do is run a new browser session and try to do this update again, but this time I'm going to log in as Bond. And so to do that, I'm going to go ahead and close out my current browser session, open up a new browser session, and then go out to my app server on port 8010 and run statusupdate.sjs. And now I'm going to log in as Bond. So that's a username of Bond, and the password is PASS. P-A-S-S. Now when I run this as Bond, I see that I'm once again getting that execute privilege error. And that makes sense because Bond has the secret read role. He does not have the project admin role. Therefore, he's in the same boat that M was prior to this. He's not able to do this. Now just for fun, let's see what would happen if we actually gave Bond's role the XDMP value execute privilege. So to do that, I'm just going to manually go over to the admin interface, and I'm going to look under security, and I'm going to find roles, and I'm going to look for that secret read role. So scroll down here, here's our secret read role, and let's go ahead and set the XDMP value privilege. So I just do a find here when I'm working with the interface because it makes it a little easier. And I click that, and then let's go ahead and say OK. So now we have given the secret read role this execute privilege. We should be able to do this, or at least eliminate this error. So let's try this. Let's run this, and we are able to eliminate that execute privilege error, but we get another error. Take a minute to look at this. Permission denied is what this error is. And this is because we know that Bond does not have a role with an update permission on this document. Therefore, what he's trying to do in this module is not allowed by our security model, and he cannot do it. Let's implement the AMP, which will let him be able to perform this update. All right, so just to be consistent here, what I really want to do is go back and take away the XDMP value privilege from the secret read role, because again, remember our best practice that we only want to give the minimum permissions required in order to do their job. And since we're going to be amping Bond to the project admin role, and the project admin role has that execute privilege, there's no need for the secret read role to have it as well. Okay. Let's go back then to Query Console. And what we're going to do next is take a look at the tab titled Setup AMP. And here we're using the Management REST API to create a new AMP in our system. Now an AMP is going to be a document that is stored in the security database. And that document has some specific configuration that really defines a reference to the function that we wish to amp. So here we see that the local name of that function is update status, and that aligns with the function in our amped functions SJS module. That module is stored in our modules database, and the role that we wish to amp to when executing this function is our project admin role. Now, to create this, we're going to do it through the Management REST API and the amps endpoint. Keep in mind that you could have also created an amp by going out through the admin interface, and under security, you could select amps, and you could create a new amp through the user interface. All right, let's go back to Query Console, where we're going to do this programmatically because that would enable us to really easily create some automated setup scripts for our project. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this tab called Setup Amp. And we get the response that indicates that amp was created. Now, if I wanted to validate that this amp was created, I could go back to the admin interface, refresh my amps page, and I should be able to then find the amp that we just created, which, if you recall, it was created on the function called update status, and sure enough, there we see our amp defined. All right, the next thing we need to do is actually test this out to see if it works. And so if we look at the tab titled Final Test, we'll see some comments indicating how we're going to test it. And we're simply going to create a new browser session, go out to our app server, run this module, log in as Bond, and see if we are able to successfully do the update. So just to refresh our memory, let's see what the current document looks like. And we see that there is no status update in this document. Now let's open up a new browser session, and let's go out to our app server. And let's run the status update module. And I'm going to log in as Bond again. That's a username of Bond and a password of pass. And what we see is that I get the message that it looks like my code ran successfully. And of course, we could go back out and validate that the actual document was updated. And sure enough, we see that the update occurred. And here we have now successfully implemented an amp. We've enabled Bond to do an update through the update function that we are amping. But outside of that function call, Bond does not have any rights in our security model to do document updates. And that's a great example of an amp in action. In completing this tutorial, you learned how to describe amps and their purpose in applications, as well as how to set up and use amps. Don't forget to take the next steps. If you haven't done so already, make sure you go to developer.marklogic.com to download and install MarkLogic. You can access the code examples in this tutorial and others from MarkLogic University's GitHub site. And if you need more training, visit marklogic.com/training, where you can learn more about all of our various instructor-led, self-paced, and on-demand training options. And finally, don't forget to show off your new skills. Add MarkLogic as a skill on your LinkedIn profile today. Thank you for watching this MarkLogic University on-demand tutorial.